We have more for your ears only. I'm Catherine Herzog.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. Sometimes I thought I did not make my mark as a foreign correspondent because the CIA never once asked me for information. That was a wry retrospective by Albert Kaff on a far-ranging journalistic career that spanned nearly 7 decades, many in Asia for United Press International, and lately covering the professional and personal milestones of other journalists for the Overseas Press Club of America Monthly Bulletin. He died last week at 92. Now this.
America's president #1, founding father Washington, John Adams' second president, the very first White House resident.
From a website video of the White House Historical Association, now celebrating its 50th year. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. is probably the most well-known address in the U.S., and from Adams to Obama, the allure of the White House endures, enchanting us with its rich political history, artful design, and varied parade of presidential residence. Through it all, imagery, especially photography, has played a key role in cultivating respect, reverence, even affection.
Think of John F. Kennedy watching as the first Americans flew into space, President Nixon shaking Elvis Presley's hand, and even more recent photographs of America's first African-American First Lady teaching the importance of healthy diet to children in the White House garden. Noted photography author Vicki Goldberg explores these famous photos and more taken at America's most famous home in the White House, the president's home in photographs and history, just published by Little Brown and Company. And for your ears only, Vicki Goldberg is on the line now. Welcome to our program.
Thanks. I'm happy to be there.
How many photos are in the book, and how many at the White House Historical Association did you have to look through to select them?
There are 250 photographs in the book from the 1840s to 2010. I must have looked through 5,000 or 6,000 images at the White House Historical Association, and then I found some more, they found some more. We took some from presidential libraries and some from the White House Flickr stream. So goodness knows how many it was in the end.
Well, what standards did you use to select the final photos, and how long did it take you?
Well, it took me several years, although I was doing other things at the same time, writing introductions to monographs particularly, but the standards were, first of all, it had to be an arresting photograph. This is really a book about photographs. Secondly, there were a number of very famous pictures, some of which David Alpern has mentioned, that I felt I should include, but I didn't want to have only the pictures that were familiar to people. Most of these pictures haven't been published for decades, a couple of them never published. And that struck me as very interesting.
What's the most interesting thing you learned from those oldest photos, especially about the design or construction of the White House itself?
Well, the oldest photos of the house are one thing, but I think everything's pretty old about the house. Most of the pictures are well over 50 years old. And I was stunned to discover how decrepit the White House was at different times, partly because it was built on swampy ground, partly because the population increased so rapidly. Washington had about 5 million people in 1800, had about 80 million people by 1900, and all of them tried to crowd into the White House receptions, and it meant that in Grant's, one of the floors was unsteady. In Teddy Roosevelt's time, the house was a terrible wreck. There was a ceiling that had fallen. Fortunately, nobody was under it. And in Truman's time, the house was really uninhabitable. So we found a number of photographs of construction, particularly under Truman's time, when the house was in such bad shape they considered tearing it down. And Truman, who cared about history, said, "You can't do that. It'll demoralize the American populace." So they gutted the house, leaving the interior walls intact. And there's a photograph of a bulldozer inside the White House, something that hadn't occurred to me was possible.
Tell us about a Christmas Eve photo from 1929 that you've included in the book, and that's hardly in the holiday spirit.
On Christmas Eve, the president was the president's wife was entertaining the children of White House staff when a fire broke out in the West Wing, and somebody very quietly notified Hoover, who raced over to try to save important papers, went into the building. They yanked him out fast because the fire was spreading very rapidly. There were lots of papers there. So there's a big there's a picture of this fire going on. It was very fortunate that the department managed to save the White House, which was not damaged, but the West Wing was badly damaged. A huge crowd gathered and made it very difficult for some of the firemen to get there.
There's an unusually dark portrait of Richard Nixon. Talk about the White House atmosphere at the time it was taken and chosen, not to mention the darker time to come from Watergate and his resignation.
Well, that was taken in September of 1970. And Vietnam was still going on, and Nixon was trying to find a way out of it. 4 months earlier, the National Guard had killed a student at Kent State. There were still demonstrations. So he had a lot going on that front. And also, it looked very much like Salvador Allende, who was a Marxist socialist, was going to be the next president of Chile. And the Nixon administration was very worried about communism in Latin America, so that was a big problem. And also, intelligence had discovered that the Soviets were expanding their base in Cuba. He had a lot on his mind, but what interested me is that the full one half of his face is in shadow, and the remaining quarter is in light. It looks like a picture of Nixon's personality to me. He was a very divided man.
Vicki Goldberg is the author of The White House, the President's Home in Photographs and History, just published by Little Brown and Company. And this has been For Your Ears Only.